Welcome back to this week's episode of Undoctrinated with your hosts, myself, Belle Reese, and Garfield Green. Today, we'll be exploring the swamp city state that is Washington, D.C., and our so called representatives in Congress. But before we drag you through the muck and tell you all the details, let me lay out the basic structure of our government the way we were all taught in school. The U.S. government is structured in three branches, plain and simple: legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch, Congress, writes the law. The executive enforces the law, headed by the president, and the judicial interprets the law through the courts. Clean, constitutional checks and balances. What we do not learn about in school, what they so conveniently left out, is the fourth very illegal branch of government, the bureaucracy. This unconstitutional swamp monster is operated by unelected bureaucrats, career administrators, agency heads, and faceless paper pushers who have taken upon themselves a slew of administrative duties. They create rules that carry the force of law, operate entire cabinet departments and independent agencies, implement and often rewrite the laws Congress passes, regulate entire industries, basically manage the country's day to day operations with no authority, very, very little oversight, if any, and zero accountability to the American people. Now, think of the bureaucracy as the toxic runoff and rotting dead matter that slowly turned our clean, simple, limited form of government into the festering swamp we're all drowning in today. But this swamp didn't just appear naturally. Lobbyists and special interest money poured in from the beginning, feeding it, bankrolling campaigns, and steering those we elected to represent us straight into the arms of the bureaucratic bayou beast. So, yeah, a lot of the fault lies with our supposed civic servants. Too many of them end up, or start out, serving the bureaucracy instead of us. They represent its interests, protect its polluted water, help it grow, fatten their wallets, and then turn around and tax us harder each year to fund and expand this illegal fourth branch. Every legitimate branch of government and every employee in them has a clearly defined job description in the United States Constitution. Each branch was designed to check and balance the others. Yet the swamp overrides that. There is no left or right when it comes to the lobbyist forces that pay for campaigns and keep their bureaucratic machine humming. In the end, both sides are sustained by the same corrupt, unconstitutional racket. That's why, and you've heard us say this before, voting won't fix it. Even voting for the Save America candidate won't save America as long as there's profit to be made in DC. The swamp couldn't care less about who lives in the White House or which party has the majority. It only cares that the money keeps pouring in through bloated budgets, endless foreign wars, and the insider deals that turn public office into a personal ATM. And that's exactly the pattern we're ripping open today: the pipeline between DC wealth and warfare. Come to think of it, maybe that's how the swamp got so polluted, all that Middle Eastern oil. Anyways, the politicians who vote for these conflicts, approve the funding, and hold war industry stocks in their portfolios never lose a wink of sleep over skyrocketing gas prices, groceries we can't afford, or the young men and women coming home in coffins. They just keep cashing the checks while we foot the bill in blood, in taxes, and in national debt that's burying our kids and grandkids. So stay tuned. We're going to show exactly how this illegal fourth branch and its lobbyist feeders have turned our endless war into their endless profit. Because until we face the ugly truth about the swamp and how warfare is their biggest cash cow, we're never going to drain it.
Yeah, and what Bell just laid out is relatively important to understand because once you start looking at Washington through that lens, something else begins to jump out that most people never talk about. If you follow the money in DC long enough, you begin to notice a very consistent pattern when it comes to wealth. A lot of the people who enter Congress do not start out extraordinarily wealthy. Many of them arrive with fairly normal financial backgrounds, certainly comfortable in many cases, but not the kind of wealth that would make you blink twice. And yet, somehow, year after year, term after term, the same thing keeps happening. Members of Congress who are earning a government salary, it's currently around 174,000 a year, leave office with fortunes that place them among the wealthiest people in the country. Now, that should raise a question for anyone who's paying attention because while $174,000 is certainly a respectable income, it's not the kind of salary that usually produces multimillionaires in a relatively short period of time. And yet, we see it happen over and over again. Members of Congress routinely outperform the stock market. Their portfolios often grow at a pace that professional investors struggle to replicate. And the explanation that is usually given is that they simply make smart investments. When you zoom out and look at how Washington actually operates, you start to see why those investments might be so consistently successful. The same people who are writing laws, approving regulations, and voting on federal budgets are often sitting on committees that oversee the very industries they invest in. The same legislators who vote on war spending might also hold shares in the war contractors. The same policymakers regarding energy markets might hold energy stocks. And the same officials shaping healthcare policy might have investments to connect to pharmaceutical companies. And suddenly, what looks like luck starts to look a lot more like insider trading. And that insider trading is fueled by one of the most powerful forces in Washington: lobbyists. Lobbyists represent industries with enormous financial stakes in government decisions. Entire sectors of the economy depend on the outcomes of policy votes coming out of Congress. Things like war, pharmaceuticals, finance, energy, technology, and those energies pour billions of dollars into lobbying efforts to make sure that their interests are protected. They fund campaigns to help shape legislation before the public ever even hears about it. And perhaps most importantly, they maintain relationships with the people inside government who have the authority to make those decisions. But the relationship doesn't stop there because Washington also runs on something called the revolving door. Staffers leave Capitol Hill and immediately become lobbyists for the industries they once regulated. And then agency officials step down from government positions and take high paying jobs with the companies they previously oversaw. And now, all of a sudden, politicians retire from Congress and suddenly find themselves sitting on corporate boards, working as consultants or speaking at events sponsored by the same industries that lobbied them while they were in office. When you look at the ecosystem as a whole, it starts to resemble way less of a government that is serving the public and seeking their highest good, and more close to a network where influence circulates among the same small group of people. Now, nowhere is that system more visible than when you start looking at war industry spending. The United States spends more on its military than the next several countries combined, and a massive portion of that spending flows through relatively small number of war contractors. Companies that manufacture weapon systems, military aircraft, missiles, surveillance technology, logistics support, you name it. These companies rely heavily on federal contracts, and those contracts depend entirely on decisions made by Congress and the executive branch. And when war does happen, or when conflicts start to escalate, or when a new global threat is declared, those contracts tend to grow dramatically, which means the incentives start to line up in a very troubling way. War industry contractors have a direct financial interest in expanding military budgets and maintaining long term conflict environments. Those companies lobby Congress aggressively to protect those budgets. Members of Congress approve those budgets, and many of those same members of Congress hold investments tied to the companies that profit from the spending that they authorize. Now, add foreign aid into that equation, and when Congress approves foreign aid packages, a large portion of that aid often takes the form of military assistance. Weapon systems, equipment, war support, all funded by American taxpayers. But here's the part that many people don't realize. That money frequently circles right back into the US war industry because foreign governments receiving military aid often use those funds to purchase equipment from American contractors. So the pipeline starts to look something like this. Congress approves billions in war or spending. Then the taxpayer dollars flow out through federal budgets. Those funds then end up purchasing weapon systems from private war contractors, and then those contractors generate enormous profits. And when a portion of that money circles back into Washington through lobbying, campaign donations, and influence networks, and The same policymakers who approve the spending in the first place are often financially connected to the industries benefiting from it. This is what economists call an incentive problem. Because when the people responsible for dictating whether a war happens, how long it lasts, and how much money is spent on it are operating inside a system that financially benefits from those outcomes, you create a structure where conflict becomes extremely profitable. And war stops being just a geopolitical decision and starts becoming an economic engine. And when that happens, the consequences are massive. Endless conflicts become easier to justify. Military budgets continue expanding. The national debt keeps climbing. And not to mention the human cost. The soldiers deployed overseas and all the families that are affected, this is the only economic transaction in which human American lives are used as the currency. And this is the part that people often struggle to accept because it sounds too cynical at first. But if you step back and look at the pattern long enough, the incentives become way too hard to ignore. The system that approves war is often financially connected to the industries that profit from it. It's as simple as that. And the same people who vote on military budgets are often positioned to benefit from the economic ripple effects of those decisions. And at the end of the day, when the referee in the game is also invested in the outcome, the rules of the game start to change, which is why understanding the structure matters so much. Because if we're serious about draining the swamp, and that phrase does get thrown around a lot, we have to be honest about how the swamp actually feeds itself. It's not just about a few bad politicians, it's about a whole financial ecosystem that rewards certain behaviors and quietly punishes others. And until people understand how that system operates, it will keep running exactly the way that it has for decades.
Exactly. So let's get this straight. While groceries, gas, and rent keep getting more unaffordable for millions of Americans, the swamp creatures in DC get richer off overseas conflicts that hit the American taxpayer right where it hurts, our wallets. And this isn't some new scam. It's the same old story that's played out for 90% of the United States' existence. The politicians who vote for war and the presidents, plural, who illegally start wars without congressional declarations never pay the price. They never bleed. They never lose family. They never have to just scrape by, but they always profit. Take the current US Israel conflict with Iran. Call it a war or not, it is a war. In just the first 100 hours, we bled $3.7 billion and 6 American lives. First 100 hours. By the first 10 days, the tab hit $10.35 billion and one more US life. Meanwhile, our national debt sits at 39 trillion and climbing, and we're still playing deadly war games in the Middle East. We've been meddling there for 225 years, with the last 35 years being near continuous high level involvement. These Eastern escapades have cost America 7,500 US lives and roughly $10 trillion, about a quarter of our entire national debt. We're constantly sold the same excuse. We have to secure Middle East oil to keep prices low, keep the tankers moving safely, and avoid an energy crisis. In other words, it's supposedly all about protecting American wealth. President Trump even said, if we have a little high oil prices for a little while, but as soon as this ends, those prices are going to drop. I believe lower than even before. Okay? Sure. But if we stop dumping trillions and burning huge amounts of oil on endless Middle East wars, we could keep more of our own domestic production, which, newsflash, is already large enough to sustain us right here at home. We'd cut the massive fuel waste from military ops, dodge the global price spikes that our conflict creates, and finally, get real energy independence. The math couldn't be cleaner. Less war equals less oil burned overseas, less money wasted, and lower gas prices for Americans. Everything else is an excuse to keep the warmongers in our slimy Congress and the grubby DC lobbyists fat and happy. We all know they can't do that clean math because clean math doesn't help them get away with defrauding the American people.
Yeah, exactly. When you start looking closely at where all that money actually goes, you begin to see that it doesn't just disappear into some abstract government black hole. It lands somewhere, and more often than not, it lands in the hands of the very specific set of corporations and industries that have built an entire ecosystem around Washington, D.C. An ecosystem that runs heavily on lobbying, campaign funding, and influence over the very policies that decide whether those conflicts continue or not. Lobbyists play a massive role in shaping the decisions that come out of Washington. These are the people hired by major industries to represent their financial interests in front of lawmakers. And in the case of the war industry, the stakes are enormous. Billions upon billions of dollars in military conflict are on the line every single year. And the companies competing for those contractors understand that if they want to protect their businesses, they need influence over the people writing the budgets and shaping the legislation. So lobbyists fund campaigns, they build relationships with politicians, they help draft policy language, and they make sure their industry's priorities stay front and center when Congress starts deciding where federal dollars are going to be spent. And that influence becomes even more powerful when you realize that a huge portion of the American war industry is concentrated in just a handful of companies. You've probably heard the names before: Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman. These companies sit at the center of the U.S. war and military sector, and they receive enormous government contracts to build everything from fighter jets and missile systems to surveillance technology and weapons platforms. Their entire business model depends heavily on federal and military spending, and that spending tends to grow when conflicts escalate. When new threats are identified and when the military operations expand around the world, and because much of their own revenue comes from government contractors, these companies invest heavily in making sure they have influence in Washington. They spend tens of millions of dollars every year on lobbying efforts, maintaining consistent contacts with lawmakers, shaping war policy conversations, and ensuring that military budgets continue to move in a direction that benefits their industry. Now, none of this means every conflict is manufactured or every person in Washington is malicious, but it does reveal something much deeper about the structure of the system. When wars do happen, the system begins to reward conflict. Not necessarily because anyone stands up and says, let's start another war, everybody, but because the financial incentives embedded in the system quietly align in that direction. The same people approving war budgets are interacting consistently with the industries that benefit from those budgets. The same policymakers authorizing foreign military aid are working with a lobbying environment shaped heavily by military contractors. And so, like I was saying earlier, when you step back and look at that entire structure, it creates a serious incentive problem, which raises a question that I think more Americans should be asking. These war industry contractors have Congress wrapped around their fingers with all the lobbying and influence that flows to Washington. So, if they're helping shape the policy and if they benefit from the budgets that fund these conflicts, how exactly is Congress handling its constitutional responsibility when it comes to war these days? Do they still formally declare it in the way that the people stipulate in the Constitution, or is something else going on here?
Well, actually, Congress hasn't formally declared war since World War II, June 5th, 1942, to be exact, when they declared war on Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. That is the last time. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution is clear. Congress has the sole power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, a government permission for private citizens to attack, capture enemy property during conflict without officially declaring war, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. No wiggle room there. Yet, every single major conflict since 1945, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and now this Iran debacle has been started, escalated, and sustained by presidents without a formal declaration. They call it police actions, limited strikes, authorizations, or just plain executive authority. Laughable? Without a doubt. Illegal? Absolutely. They even tried to fix this, give the Constitution the good old DC workaround with the 1973 War Powers Resolution, which supposedly requires presidents to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing forces and get approval within 60 days, or even 90 in some cases, or they have to pull out. Sounds fine on paper, right? No! It's completely unconstitutional. Congress can't delegate its exclusive war declaring power to the president through statute. And either way, presidents have ignored or circumvented it ever since. Almost every president since 1973. They rarely even enforce it today. So much for checks and balances. Despite that total surrender of their war declaring power, they'll still rubber stamp war spending bills every single year. The 2026 NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, is the yearly law where Congress approves the budget and policies for the U.S. military. Alone is sitting at $923 billion, up from $886 billion in 2025, and it passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. They won't vote to check or balance the executive's overreach on starting or dragging out wars, but they'll approve the Pentagon's blank check without so much as blinking. Pretty interesting, if you ask me. And it's not a partisan thing. Both right and left are lobbied hard by all the war giants that Garfield previously mentioned. And every time Congress passes one of those bloated defense budgets, those companies' portfolios swell with new contracts and potential income. Republicans were screaming bloody murder during Obama's drone strikes and Libya intervention. But the majority still voted to fund the budgets that kept those programs alive. 700 plus billion a year under Obama, no problem. The same exact thing is happening now with Trump and his military operations. Congress criticizes on camera, then quietly approves record war industry spending that funds it all. Those are big claims, to say the least. So, Garfield, could you elaborate on the specifics of what and who I've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just go ahead and list off some of the exact people that have been playing a role in everything we've been talking about, because we don't want you guys to think that we're just making all these claims and we have nothing to back it up with. And when you do start looking at the actual financial connections inside Congress, I think that you're going to begin to realize that these war and defense decisions are not being made in some vacuum of pure national interest. Take congressional stock trading, for example. Members of Congress are legally allowed to buy and sell stocks in industries that are directly affected by the policies they vote on. That alone should make you uncomfortable because it means the same individuals who approve military budgets and foreign policy initiatives are sometimes financially invested in companies that benefit from those decisions. And one of the most widely discussed examples is Nancy Pelosi. Regardless of what anybody thinks about her politically, the financial data surrounding congressional stock activity shows that she has been one of the most active investors connected to war-related companies in Congress. In fact, according to several financial tracking analysis of congressional trading activity, Pelosi ranks as the second most active member holding war industry-linked stocks overall, just behind Representative Josh Gottheimer. And when you start looking at who else shows up in these investment patterns, you quickly realize that it's not just one party or one ideological faction. This isn't a red team or a blue team issue, it's systemic. A number of members of Congress across both parties hold notable investments connected to the war industry. Just to name a few of them, Josh Gottheimer, Tommy Tuberville, Susan Collins, Jerry Morin, Pat Fallon, Gilbert Cisneros, Mark Wayne Mullen, Julie Johnson, John Boozman, Michael McCall. All of these individuals, according to publicly disclosed financial records, have held investments tied to military contractors or related industries. Some of them sit on committees that directly influence military spending or foreign policy decisions. Others vote regularly on the National Defense Authorization Act and other appropriations bills that determine how hundreds of billions of dollars in war funding are distributed each year. And that financial relationship doesn't stop with stock ownership. War companies are also deeply involved in campaign financing. Over multiple election cycles, major war industry contractors have contributed millions of dollars in campaign donations to members of Congress from both parties. These companies spend their contributions widely, making sure they maintain relationships with key lawmakers, regardless of which party happens to be in control at any given moment. Because from the perspective of the war industry, political ideology is far less important than maintaining access and influence within the system. So, what you end up with is a very strange dynamic. On television, you'll see politicians arguing passionately about foreign policy, criticizing military operations, or warning about the dangers of escalation. But behind the scenes, many of those same lawmakers are voting to approve the budgets that fund those operations. And some of them are financially connected to the industries benefiting from that spending. And again, this is not a partisan phenomenon. It cuts across both Republicans and Democrats. Members from both parties hold defense related investments and vote on military spending bills and foreign policy initiatives that directly affect the profitability of those companies, which creates a situation where the same public servants who are supposed to represent the interests of the American people are operating inside a financial ecosystem that rewards the expansion of war spending and the continuation of global military involvement. And when we start to put all of those pieces together, it becomes much easier to understand why the system tends to keep moving in the same direction, regardless of which party holds power. And it starts to become much more clear that maybe our public servants are not really trying to serve or look out for the people. And that is a hard realization to come to.
Everything Garfield just laid out, the names, stocks, the campaign cash, all the slimy war profiteering in DC screams incentives. Incentives to start war, incentives to stay in war. Congress obviously isn't voting to stop or start these things. They're passive. They delay any and all real oversight. Or they do absolutely nothing when the executive branch starts to drag us into yet another undeclared conflict. And again, where do these incentives come from? That same illegal fourth branch we've been talking about from the start, the bureaucracy. Unelected, unaccountable, and always growing. They don't just sit and fester, they actively sustain military operations, keep the machine running, no matter who the president is. And the worst part, they'll expand their own authority every single time there's a conflict. Opportunists is far too kind a word for these bureaucrats, to say the least. Look what happened after 9/11. The bureaucracy exploded. The Patriot Act, NSA surveillance on steroids, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, new overwhelming powers for CIA and FBI, endless emergency regulations that never seem to expire. They used the crisis to grab more control, more funding, more reach. And Congress? They handed it all over with barely a whimper, because they're just good dogs who already got their bones. So, when Congress refuses to reclaim their constitutional war powers, when they let quote unquote limited strikes turn into decades long dilemmas, when they fund the Pentagon no matter how many undeclared wars we rack up, it is not incompetence. It's loyalty. Not to us, no. Loyalty to the swamp. Loyalty to the bureaucracy that keeps wars going, the contractors paid, and their own privileges intact and expanding. The swamp doesn't just survive on war, it feeds on it, grows from it, and makes sure the cycle never ends. And the American people pay the price every single time. But we're done watching them play their war games while we bleed for it. We're done pretending votes alone will drain the swamp when its whole ecosystem is rigged to profit from the very chaos it creates. It's time we take the fight to them on their turf with real tools, real accountability, and real consequences. Sitting here listing every single crime they commit won't bring them any closer to justice. We do, however, know something that will. Tactical Civics has the game plan. So, how do we end this cycle once and for all?
Well, and this is really the turning point in this whole conversation because once you understand how the swamp actually operates, the next question becomes obvious. What do you actually do about it? And unfortunately, the answer most Americans have been given for decades is simply to vote harder. Ah, yes, vote harder every 4 years or every midterm. Replace one politician with another and hope that somehow the incentives magically disappear. But the reality we've been laying out today shows exactly why that hasn't worked. The swamp doesn't disappear when one election changes the names on a few office doors, because the structure underneath those offices remains exactly the same. That's why tactical civics approaches the problem from a completely different direction. Instead of trying to influence Washington from the outside, the strategy is to restore the constitutional mechanisms that were originally designed to hold the government accountable in the first place. Because the founders didn't build a system where the only power that the American people had was to vote once every few years and then hope that the politicians behaved themselves. They built a system where the people themselves retained direct authority through lawful civic institutions, institutions that were meant to check government power at the local level. Two of the most important of those institutions are grand jury and the militia. And these are not theoretical ideas or historical relics. They are lawful, pre constitutional structures that were designed to allow citizens to enforce the law when public officials refused to do their jobs. The grand jury was never intended to function merely as a tool of prosecutors the way that it does often today. Historically, it served as an investigative body of the people themselves, capable of examining corruption, issuing indictments, and holding public servants accountable under the law. Likewise, the militia was never meant to resemble a caricature that modern media portrays. In the constitutional framework, the militia functions as the people's enforcement arm of lawful authority, including when operating in support of the grand jury, serving subpoenas, executing warrants, and arresting and ensuring prosecution of criminals in public office. Tactical Civics trains and briefs willing Americans to return to our ancient duties in both institutions and at the county level. Not through violence or chaos, and not through political theater, but through lawful organization, education, and constitutional enforcement. Because if you think about the problems we've been discussing in this episode, undeclared wars, bureaucratic overreach, corrupt financial incentives in Washington, they all share one common factor: the absence of oversight by the only human power authorized to wield it: we the people. These activities are all classified as organized crime when they're perpetrated by private citizens, but politicians, the arrogant perpetrators of this multi-trillion-dollar overthrow of our government, turning it into an ATM machine for criminal enterprise, made themselves above the law, turning supposed checks and balances into a mutual defense arrangement. They might face accusations during election season, but just look at the re-election statistics. The real problem in DC is organized crime. Tactical Civics exists to end DC organized crime and finally enforce what we stipulate in our highest law. By restoring the lawful authority of county grand juries and true militia at the county level, the American people resume the highest office in government. Investigating, arresting, indicting, and punishing corruption in public offices with monetary fines and prison time, just like the courts do for other criminals. Besides our Bring Congress Home Act to split them up and keep them under the people's watchful eye, and besides our Indictment Engine mobile app analyzing every bill they propose, which we will talk about more in the next episode, we plan to return county-level law enforcement to America like it existed for generations in early America. Year after year of political outrage and calling DC organized crime a swamp doesn't change a thing. To the end of the overthrow of America by DC organized crime, the incentive they need is arrest, felony indictment, and prison time. That's the action plan of Tactical Civics. We the people finally enforcing our highest law. That's why we say Tactical Civics isn't a political movement, it's a mission. It's a practical restoration of the constitutional framework that already exists but has been neglected for generations. So if you've been listening to this episode and wondering whether anything can actually be done about the corruption, the endless wars, the systems that profit from them, the answer is yes, but it doesn't start in Washington, it starts in counties, with Americans who look at the Tactical Civics Great Seal and realize those words are just another way of saying the first three words in our Constitution. Together, we the people are the sovereign, not the massive, long-standing organized crime network in DC. That network only kept enriching itself and controlling our republic as long as we the people refused to do our duty and enforce the Constitution, or didn't even realize that we had that authority. It's time to stop this crime and hold them accountable. And now you do know this information, and it's time for us to take action and start doing something about it and turn the tide at last. Thank you so much for listening to Undoctrinated, and we will see you next Friday.